Okay, well, welcome again, everyone, and welcome to you, Giulio. Thank you so much again for joining us. I believe, are you sitting in Italy as we speak?
I am. I'm sitting in Venice, and I have a somewhat precarious setup with my computer, so it may fall over halfway through. I hope not, but we'll see.
Well, thanks for connecting from afar. And one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that we've all learned to pivot and take advantage of these global and virtual networks. And so we're fortunate to have you with us. And it's also dawned on me, Giulio, that the first time we met was actually also virtual as part of a panel in 2015 where I presented in Oxford virtually, and you were part of the discussion on water security and sustainable growth. And it's a real privilege to be with you now in 2022 on the aftermath of your recent successful book to talk about the ideas of water biography and to help animate and motivate the work that we will all do here in Waterloo as part of the collaborative water program. So I'd like to start by providing a brief introduction. And what I noted, Giulio, is that your background, your trajectory will be really inspiring to many of us because you started as a hard scientist working on climate dynamics and oceanography with degrees from Bologna University, Princeton, and MIT. And I noted that in Google Scholar, your most widely referenced paper is on mixed layer instabilities and restratification from 2007. 15 years later, you've written a book on the history of water, a magnum opus that really traces our struggle as society to manage water. And along the way, since completing your academic degree, you've had experience at McKinsey Company where you became partner and led its sustainability and resource productivity practice. And most recently have been with the Nature Conservancy for the better part of 7 years versus managing director of water, and then more recently as the chief strategy officer. So that really is a unique trajectory that's brought you to this current moment. And if you had reflected in 2007, whether you'd be writing the next magnum opus of water, it might be a bit of a surprise to see this work that you've just put out. And what I'd like to invite you to do to kick us off is just tell us how and why did you end up writing this book, Water, a Biography, and what is the main argument that you'd like to get across?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dustin. And I should say it's a great pleasure and privilege to be with you today. And it's lovely to see all of your faces on this mosaic on my screen here. And I very much look forward to, hopefully an interactive conversation. Because one of the great pathologies of putting out a book like this one is that you end up talking about it a lot. And so I've already heard myself say these things several times before. And so the thing that I will learn today will be mostly from you. So I look forward to that. You're right. In 2007, I actually left academia in 2005. It's a symptom of the speed at which academic publishing happens that the paper came out in 2007. But yes, I could not have imagined that this is where I would have ended up. So let me tell you sort of how I got to write this book and what's its main argument, as you asked, Dustin. So first of all, my journey to water was a stepwise one. I started out as a climate scientist, and I did interface with hydrology somewhat on a very, very large scale. I left academia in search of impact. I wanted to do more than write papers, and ended up consulting to governments and businesses on issues of water security, mostly at McKinsey, as Dustin was saying. And I worked on very sort of economic and engineering like questions, from in Jordan, whether the country should build a Red Dead canal, to infrastructure in Ethiopia. I worked in Karnataka in India on sort of irrigation systems. I worked Mexico on the 2030 water security plan for the country. So I had sort of this broad experience in the basic question of countries asking what should we do with the resources we have. right? And then when I went to the Nature Conservancy, I confronted pretty much the same question, but from, incorporating in that question also the issues of ecology and kind of environmental sustainability writ large. Not that we didn't worry about environmental sustainability before, but it became a particular focus of my work. And the more I worked on this, so I ended up doing this for the better part of 15 years in the end, between the various sort of angles across about a dozen countries. And what became apparent to me over time was that whilst the question, what should we do with the resources that we have, sounds like a very technical question that has a technical answer. Well, we should build these desalination plants and those dams and these canals and grow this stuff here and not grow this stuff there and have this size of city. You end up having kind of a planner's view of the world. What ended up transpiring for me was the fact that in the end, these were very sort of political with a big P questions, because in the end, water is this extraordinary force that manifests itself on the landscape. It's the principal agent of the climate system on the landscape. It, by its very nature, commands and requires that we act collectively somehow, right? No single individual can deal with a weather system in the mid-latitudes, about 1,000 kilometers in radius. No single individual can decide the fate of the Colorado River. And any single individual making a choice in one part of the river inevitably has some consequence and some impact on somebody else downstream or upstream or next door, right? So I came to realize that these were really fundamentally political questions. And the underlying answer, if you kind of scratch the surface of all these options that we were putting in front of countries, the dam, the desalination plant, the reservoir, you ended up realizing that the real question were questions of rules and behaviors and, who decides what where, what does our home look like? The west of the United States, I mean, it's really peculiar that I've traveled a lot in my life. And one of the things that has always astonished me is that from a water perspective, almost everywhere in the developed world, in the wealthy world, kind of everywhere kind of looks the same from a water perspective. It's actually quite extraordinary that you can walk around Tokyo or Los Angeles and pretty much have the same water experience. There's water that comes out if you open a tap. Nobody has to wade a river anywhere going to work, and so it's a non-issue, and you have green lawns everywhere, kind of regardless of the nature of the climate that people face. And so that was kind of the kind of aha, right? I mean, the starting realization that as I dealt with ministers of agriculture, ministers of water, and I tried to bring them together, or ministers of finance that had to pay for it and had to kind of come to some collective agreement as to what it is that they would have to pay for and what it looks like, you end up always having these conversations about, well, what does our home look like and what should we do in it, right? Which are kind of profound identity and existential questions. And so I got really interested in exploring those. And, in the end, so one of the kind of framing ideas for me was this kind of definition of institutions that Douglas North gave years ago that, you will know well, Dustin. Douglas North, for those of you who don't know, is an institutional economist, an economist that thinks about institutions as opposed to kind of supply and demand issues. And he talked about institutions as the constraints, I think he said something like human devised or human constructed constraints that regulate or structure all of our interactions, social, economic, right? It's a pretty broad definition, right? All the rules, behaviors, traditions that regulate our interactions, and some of how those things, those institutions, were in my mind the things that were creating this image of the home. What does our home actually look like from a water perspective and beyond? And so I started kind of scratching and digging. And eventually came on the idea. There's also a more personal version of this story, by the way, Dustin, that I can get into if you want later. But I came upon this idea that what I should do is really construct a history of ideas, try and figure out where those ideas that people had in their heads about what their home looked like and how you decide, how, construct a history of ideas and see where they came from. And so I started on this journey of sort of archaeology of ideas. Starting from today and looking back and asking myself, well, how do we end up with these beliefs, with the fact that you can live in Tokyo and and Los Angeles and have pretty much the same expectation of what water security means. And even if you live in a place that doesn't have that water security, I worked for years in Ethiopia, which is currently undergoing some pretty dramatic kind of transformations. But even there, it's pretty obvious to people what it looks like to get it right. And it looks like California or Tokyo or Italy, right? I mean, there's a sense in which everybody has an understanding, sort of universal understanding of what water security means. There's no law of nature about water security. So the question was, how do we all land there? And so that's what I tried to do. And so the book is an exploration. It's a big sort of, I hesitate to call it history because I'm not a historian, and this is not me being coy, but this is not a historian's book in a way, but it is a story of ideas. And what I tried to do is uncover the sort of pivot moments in which major ideas that might be even quite remote from issues of water that you might think about usually, when did those ideas sort of come about? And so some examples are, I end up thinking hard about the origin of democracy and of kind of the concept of the republic and what relationship that has with water and institutions on the landscape. For most of human history, we were agrarian societies, and water had a profound impact on everything anybody did. And so it's not surprising that it would have such an impact on institutions, right? So think about democracy, think about the legal system. I end up, and maybe I'll see this last thing, Dustin, and then I'll pause and kind of allow you to reflect on what I just said. But and I ended up coming to this conclusion that there's something quite particular about the republic as a foundational institution of human governance, right? The republic, most countries in the world call themselves republics. This is a very new thing. It's only only in the 20th century most countries have become republics of one form or another. And republics are the governance of the res publica. In Latin means the common good, the benefit, right? And republics are really institutions designed to intermediate individual freedom and collective action and collective benefit. And so the book at its heart is saying that the world we live in, this illusion, this kind of universal understanding of water security goes hand in hand with the universalization of the republic as a kind of fundamental ingredient to the governance of human society. And I suppose it closes by saying that we are currently undergoing a transformation. The climate system is changing. It's providing inputs and signals that go well beyond what we've experienced over the last several hundred years. And as it does, it tests the resilience of these institutions, including the Republican arrangements that most countries have found to govern their landscape. And so the question of kind of what that will do and where it will lead us is kind of where the book sort of ends. And it's an open-ended question, right? But it asks for people to engage with this question very urgently. So I suppose my attempt was to lift water out of a discussion amongst engineers, which can be a very interesting discussion, but is ultimately not where the meat of it actually is, and bring it into the politics with the big P, into the language that we use to author our life, right? The language of politics, the language that allows us to negotiate with each other, to understand what we do with our sort of collective resources.
You mind if I jump in there, Giulio?
Yeah, please.
I mean, first of all, I want to follow up in a few areas related to the book, and then invite us to first step back and then to look forward. I mean, the ultimate goal here is really to draw on your insights about how to think of water problems and solutions. And I should take up your offer. And for those who don't know, we've known each other for a long time, and under other circumstances would have great debates and dialogue. So I want to bring that spirit in here, and feel free to push questions back at me or to the wider group, and put challenges for us to reflect on. This is an informal and interactive space.
Sure.
The first reaction when I read your book is, it was as if I were, opening a big present and not sure what to expect. And I have to admit, I was surprised to see this insight about political theory and institutions, given your broader experiences, particularly your own commitment to innovation and technology and data science, and engineering in the broadest sense. So I guess the first reaction that I have is related to your argument that it's about the ideas and the rules. And I wanted to just push back and ask you, what is the balance or the relationship between technological solutions and policy solutions? What is the role for each? How do they work together from your perspective?
Well, they certainly they work together. It's not so much a balance because they're not on the same sort of level to me. I mean, I think there's technology, the techne, the practice, the kind of how do you solve the material problem is in service of those broader political questions. And so they operate on different planes. You know, you and I knew John Briscoe. I'll bring his kind of voice in here because that's the personal anecdote here that I thought I'd learn. You know, when I started writing the book, so John, you guys probably don't know him, but John was a sort of a, you know, a pretty famous sort of water person. He was a professor at Harvard most recently, but he had been the head of water at the World Bank for many, many years, and was one of these kind of extraordinary individuals that was an engineer by training and a very competent one, but also embraced this broader view of life, also kind of born out of his experience in the field. He had started out working on cholera issues actually early on, and so public health issues, and then transitioned to water resources later in life. And in many ways, the book, I started writing the book, I opened a file, titled it Water Book, and then started typing the week after he passed. So I think somehow, you know, I think I was trying to maintain a conversation going. And so part of the reason there are all these institutional and historical aspects is because that's the conversation I was having with him and had with him, and you know, many others had with him over the years. So in a way, this was also an attempt at keeping alive an intellectual journey that had started with him. But my experience is that you can't separate the sort of technical and engineering aspects of water, which are profound and complicated and interesting and incredibly sort of compelling in some ways, from the ultimate commissioner, which is the public, or, you know, when you're lucky, because sometimes you're not that lucky and it's some autocrat, right? But when, in the best case, you have a community that needs to, you know, take advantage, benefit from its landscape. It has a vision of what its future looks like, and the role of engineering and the role of the institutions that it creates to manage the landscape is to make that vision happen. And so in order to know what engineering you need, in order to know what data you might need, in order to know what answer you have to provide, you have to understand what the question is. And the question is never really a technical question, you know. As an example, the West of the United States, which I talk a lot about in the book, particularly in the last part of the book, in the 20th century, the West of the United States, for a variety of obvious reasons, has become the archetype of water development in the world. It's not an accident. I mean, it was it was promoted as such all through the sort of decades after the Second World War, from the Truman administration onwards. So there's a bunch of technical assistants that went out in the world and promoted that particular vision of the landscape. Well, that landscape, you know, which originally was a very arid landscape where you wouldn't expect to have cities of the size of Los Angeles or San Diego, had a political purpose, right? It was essentially designed to look like the kind of place that a bunch of immigrants from Europe would find comfortable, and a bunch of farmers who had learned how to farm in Europe would find sort of, you know, acceptable. It actually required a bunch of agronomy to be developed. And so the question that was being asked was, how do we turn this landscape into something that looks familiar to us? And the answer, of course, ended up becoming the Hoover Dam and a whole bunch of other infrastructure that delivered things like the Imperial Valley. And it worked remarkably well because 40 million people moved to California alone. And so in some ways, it was, you know, for the question that they were asking, it was the right answer. Whether that was the right question is an entirely different issue, right? Was that the right question to ask? Was that future for California the right future to want, right? Not everybody that lived there was actually part of deliberating on what that question should look like. But for the question that was being asked, that was the right answer. So the politics may or may not have been right. The engineering was certainly right for the question they were asking. Today, fast forward 100 years, we have a different set of questions, different set of values, different set of problems, and also different set of boundary conditions, right? The climate system is changing. The Western United States is now in a period of prolonged aridity, maybe a different climatology, one that hadn't been experienced when those engineers were asking that first question, and there's a mistake that's made often in discussing the current condition of the West, which is, oh, we constructed the wrong things at the time. Those engineers were, the hubris of engineering. It wasn't really the hubris of engineering. They may have been. Those engineers were pretty confident, sometimes overconfident, but really it was a hubris of politics, right? It was the question that was being asked that was driving that answer. And if you want to have a different answer, you have to ask a different question. And so to me, this relationship between engineering and politics and institutions and history is really important, because engineering and science provides answers, but the questions get asked by somebody else. And the questions is where the power resides. Who gets to ask the question is who gets to decide what the scope of the answer actually is. And all too often, I think engineers are trained to think that they know what the question is. But that's unlikely, right? Because you don't have the lived experience of the people that you're serving. I mean, and so I think that's why, I talk a lot about dialectic in the book, which is always dangerous, because then philosophers come along and say, aha, you're, Marxist or Hegelian or this and that and the other. But I mean dialectic in a very kind of commonsensical way, which is there's this dialogue between the kind of politics of the question and the engineering of the answer, as much as there is a dialogue between the boundary conditions that are provided by nature and the vision for our future that we kind of tend to.
Well, you've given me a really good sense on this, and also a responsibility, knowing that who asks the questions has the power. And I want to bring in the students who I think will show us that many engineers are asking good questions, and there's an opportunity to think through this generation and the coming generations of engineers, natural scientists, water professionals, in terms of how to think through these water problems and solutions, and what we can learn from the past, as well as some of the limits. What I'm going to do is ask you a couple of follow-up questions, and then pivot slightly in format, because I'm noticing some really good questions coming into the chat. So I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, and then after that, go to the questions that are being posted in the chat. And for the students, what I'm going to do is bring you on to the spotlight, so you can pose your question live. So if you have any concerns about being on video and posing the question live, send me a direct message. Otherwise, I will just be incorporating you directly into the conversation. The other thing I liked about the discussion so far, Giulio, is you've been using the American West, and you really, if you look at the maps and the book that you've prepared, you've covered experiences really across the world. And so wanted to draw from those lessons as well. One of the questions that I saw coming up a lot, or the reflections that I saw coming up a lot in the inputs from the students this past week is, what are the opportunities and limits of learning for history? How far back do we really need to go? And one answer will be that history both constrains and enables the paths that we can take going forward. So that's a high level. But beyond that, what are the opportunities and limits of looking into history? How far back do the next generation of water professionals really need to go to understand the root causes of these problems, the sources of these ideas, and the space for solutions?
Well, that's it's a complicated question, which in part depends on what your theory of history is, but I don't think history is a repository of instructions or examples or things that we can directly learn, because of course all societies at some point in time have to be examined on their own terms at that particular moment, right? That's why I think it's kind of sometimes problematic to apply modern values to things like the American West and just presume that major mistakes were made, even though maybe they were made. I think so. A couple of thoughts. One is working in a number of different countries. I would posit that part of the reason to focus on history is that whilst as an engineer, as a scientist, you have ways of thinking about the problems you face that are quantified and eventually expressed in equations and calculations and measurements. The vast majority of the public and the decision makers don't think that way. They think narratively, and they start from a place of identity. And often that identity is steeped in history. And particularly if you talk to senior decision makers and politicians, one of the great skills of politicians is to use or misuse history. History is a source of narratives and stories that help mobilize, whether they're true or not, or whatever however true they can be. And so it's important to know them, because that question of who gets to ask the question, those questions which come from wanting a future for a country or a community or society, is typically informed by identity, which is itself informed by history. So what you decide to put in or exclude from that history matters a great deal to what you end up constructing as a vision for the future, and whose history are we actually talking about, and so forth. So on. For example, it's actually quite striking to me, in writing this book, this is a very Eurocentric book, for a variety of reasons. One of them is that, of course, I'm Italian and British, and so I can't really presume to know as much about other societies, histories that I know of my own, but also because, frankly, the institutions that have come to dominate, for better or for worse, many of these processes are institutions that emerged out of the imperial project of Europe. And so, it's just a reality that, a legal system from China to Los Angeles is essentially founded on Roman law. I mean, it's just a fact of where we are today. That's why I said it's not really a historian's book, because I'm actually starting from today and looking back, as opposed to kind of trying to understand processes on their own terms. So part of, your question was how much history, how far back. Part of it, as far back as it's important to understand the identity of the people involved in making the decisions. That's kind of one answer. But then the second answer, I think, is also that there's the discipline of trying to understand the context and the sources is important for those who are, scouring the landscape and designing the future. And because these are, the climate system operates on timescales that go from the daily to the centennial, and because the impacts of the modifications that we make on the landscape are, long-lived. I mean, they transform the landscape forever. I mean, I'm here in Venice. Venice did not exist before the 6th century. These are all artificial islands. These buildings are standing on, pillars of wood. It's been around for 1,500 years. It's entirely man-made, kind of like Dubai. Dubai in 1,200 years will be talked about like Venice in some ways. People forget. So I think it's really important in order to gain perspective and understand that the realm of the possible and the degrees of freedom are often much greater than we perceive if we just think of the last few decades.
I really want to come back to that. I think that it's an important point of this diversity of solutions contained by the past, this laboratory of solutions that can inform adaptation going forward, as well as lessons from past adaptations and maladaptations to some of the kinds of climate changes we would experience. I'm going to now invite a couple of the students to bring their questions in. So I'm going to bring Lucas and Jane into the spotlight to pose their questions. And I'm going to ask that they pose their questions back to back. So they'll pose them to you at the same time, and then you'll have a chance to respond to them together. So bringing in Lucas and now Jane. First to you, Lucas, and then to Jane.
First of all, thank you for joining us today. My question has to do with your work with political figures and other governmental figures, and whether there's been a common thread in the frustrations that you've experienced working with them, and potentially due to differing priorities. So along that vein.
Thanks, Lucas. And we'll just pause now and hear from Jane before giving Giulio the chance to respond.
Thanks. And thanks, Giulio, for coming today. It's been really interesting so far. My question's pretty similar to Lucas's, but basically I was just wondering, like, since you came from an academic sphere where we all are now, and then you moved working into more political and social sciences, just wondering if you noticed any like very specific areas or challenges in communication or communication barriers that us in an academic sphere might not realize, but should be aware of when we're trying to communicate to the broader public.
Right. So both great questions. Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Lucas. Well, there are a couple of elements to this. Frustrations, I'm assuming, sorry, let me just ask a clarifying question. Lucas, you meant my frustrations or frustrations amongst the different political and political operatives?
I guess your frustrations or your frustrations for conservationists and through proxy, I guess.
So I think the last 15 years have been a great exercise in learning curve in humility. It's the first thing I would say, in that, you come out of having a PhD and having studied MIT, and you somehow get this impression that the world could all be written down. Like it is, in fact, there exists a map. Maybe nobody's done it, but in principle, there is a thing where you can describe how this whole thing should work really, really well, and everything kind of functions, and you have the answer for each piece, and right. So that's the sort of mindset that you end up having initially, which I certainly had. And then, then the sort of collision with reality is a process of dismantling that illusion that there is a fact of the matter about some grand plan. The only plan that exists and that's feasible is the one that happens. And the question is really, why did it happen and what was it actually doing? And the skill of great politicians is to find that sort of really difficult balancing act between, politicians are leaders, they're not, but the leaders in the sense that, at least if not autocrats, their job is to intermediate the desires and of a community. But lead doesn't mean force. It means sort of figuring out how to articulate what's latent in a community, and that in itself is kind of an interesting problem. Then translate it for a civil service or for a kind of technocracy that's then supposed to translate that thing into a plan, right? And it's kind of this constant back and forth. And by the time you've done the plan, you might have changed the kind of initial conditions or the desires of people. So I suppose I have met many who have never learned that lesson and who spend their professional life being frustrated by how distant reality is from what they have in their head. And the fact of the matter is, my own humble opinion is that what's in their head is not the universe. It's just what's in their head. And so, I think that there is no, the practice, the reality, the practical reality is not the worst version of some theory. It's the thing that disciplines what we're trying to do. The theories need to accommodate, right? And this has a corollary, by the way, which is a thing that John actually, Dustin, you'll remember, used to say all the time, which is this is a world of second best options, right? Because in the end, you might want the whole world to have the best at all time. But if you're working, for example, if you're working in development, as many of you might end up doing, then you realize that setting the expectations from one society into another with the means of another society simply not going to work. You might aspire to perfection, but second best is better than nothing. So that kind of was my own frustration. The other, the other frustration, which I think was both mine and of the people that I worked with, is that most countries are republics, right? And now 2/3 of the countries call themselves republics, from America to say China, and even the ones that are not, like in some ways Canada or the United Kingdom. In truth, their architecture, the constitutional architecture, is very informed, by Republican principles. Hobbes had, the sort of the Leviathan, the human being on the frontispiece of the Hobbes's Leviathan is a man made of tiny little humans. It's the state is a construction that serves to manage the common good, right? And so that kind of basic idea of a republic, the legitimacy comes from the bottom, right? That's the kind of basic tenet of republicanism. So then the thing is that most republics and most Republican principles have been incorporated in the 20th century, when most countries have sort of forgotten any relationship with the landscape. Most economic theory of the 20th century has been concerned with the deployment of financial and manufactured capital and labor. And the land is a factor of production in agrarian societies, but it's not really all that important in industrial societies. And so this has very practical consequences. If you look at most governments, they have a Ministry of Industry, they'll have a Treasury, they'll have a Ministry of Economics. They may have a Ministry of Agriculture, which typically is a relatively powerless piece in developed countries and a more important part in developing countries. But they often don't have a Ministry of Water. Some do, but many don't. And even if they do, their sort of mandate is a little confused, because the constitutional architecture, the principles, the rules that those societies have given themselves have as the objective the kind of improvement of the lot, right? And that's mostly about economic growth, and economic growth is mostly about industrialization, and industrialization is mostly about capital and labor productivity and taking people out of agriculture and into industry, Arthur Lewis and all these people. So the result is that you have an architecture of government that's actually quite poorly structured to negotiate choices on the landscape. And so I've had many experiences in Ethiopia, in Jordan, in India, in Mexico, where the ministries don't have the rules nor the habit to talk to each other. And so you end up in a situation where the Ministry of Agriculture imagines the future of agriculture quite independently of, if there is, a Ministry of Environment. And then they both come with a bill that goes to the Treasury, which wasn't part of any of the conversations, right? And this ends up not just delivering second best options, but third or fourth best options often. And that's a common problem. The issue is that, so you sit there and you say, oh, that's obvious. You should have a coordinating mechanism and right? I mean, isn't this just a matter of getting them together and talk to each other? Actually, it turns out it's a bit more complicated than that, because, I mean, think of this: the macroeconomic models that, ministries of economy use to make predictions and plan have no geographical information in them, right? General equilibrium models don't actually have anything about the geography of the places that most models, not all, but most models. And so geography is sort of an irrelevant consideration in economic, in sort of traditional economic development questions. But of course, you're dealing with water. It's everything, right? Water flows downhill. That you have a mountain makes a difference to whether you have a river or not. So that's, I think, a common frustration. By the way, I don't know if you guys can hear it, but I have bells in the church next door. So if you can hear that, I apologize.
No, so far you're fine.
Okay, good. It's Saint Zachary, a remarkable church in Venice. Anyway, so the solution to that is actually less obvious than one would think, because you have to really rethink the role of landscape in the kind of in the constitutional arrangement of countries. Right? I mean, most countries don't even talk about the landscape in their constitutions. And if they do, they mostly talk about it in aesthetic terms, not in cultural terms, not in resource terms. So that's a second source of frustration, the fact that, the architecture, the political architecture evolved and developed, and the technocracy grew at a time when people thought we had sort of solved the problem of water and the landscape, and we just had to concentrate on industry verticals. And that causes no end of frustrations for most people.
Giulio, before we move on, did you have anything you wanted to add on the strategies and frustrations of communicating with politicians?
I mean,
Well, maybe let me put it a different way, if
yeah.
you will. I'm going to thank Lucas and Jane. I'm going to take you off the spotlight. And what I'd like to do is give you something to react to.
To go to speaker view. There we go. Ah.
Okay, so first of all, this will be very familiar to you.
Yes.
And will be new to many of us. So bear with me while I make this big enough for everyone to see it. Okay, so now that we've had the introduction and you reminded us of your timeline, leaving academia in 2005, it gives new perspective to me, at least, to introduce this image that you see here. And I'd actually like you to introduce it in a moment. From Charting Our Water Future, which I believe was published in 2009. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And was a serious attempt to raise the profile of water on the political agenda. At least that's my read on the situation. Yeah. So, you know, kind of corollary to your argument, if water and these historical ideas really emphasize the importance of politics and institutions, then the question is how to gain attention and how to get better responses from governments, from ministries, from civil society and other players. So I wondered if you could walk us through this, you know, fairly influential figure, what it is, why you did it, and reflecting now on what worked and what didn't about the strategy here.
Yeah, well, so this came on the back of
keep in mind, we haven't introduced this, so take a moment to give your version.
Okay, so in 2009, I led the development of this report called Charting Our Water Future, which was an attempt at kind of translating the problem of water for political leaders around the world. I was at McKinsey at the time. We did this with the World Bank and World Economic Forum and a bunch of different companies, and had a whole lot of advisors, including John and Michael Hanneman and a bunch of other people who sort of helped us think through this. And it was essentially trying to answer questions that the political leaders and business leaders that I had encountered sort of had when talking about water, which was like, you know, the questions were that I typically got were, so what's actually the problem with water? Like, I keep hearing, you know, water is an issue, but what is the issue, right? What's the problem here? And bear in mind that you can bring out the people that don't have access to water and sanitation, and yes, but you know that you could say that of vaccines. I mean, the poverty is an issue, everybody knows it, but that's not the sort of thing that will kind of engage somebody in the United States or, you know, a CEO of a large company. Does any of the issues would matter to me as a leader? That was the kind of question. And then once you tell me what the problem is, you better have some solution, because if you tell me problems that don't have solutions, I'm simply not interested. Problems without solutions are just not, they're not relevant to anybody, right? They can be interesting, but they're just not operationally salient. They may be entertaining, but not you know, even terrifying, but they're simply not interesting, which is why, incidentally, the recent documentary about the asteroid hitting the Earth feels like a strange metaphor for the predicament we're in. So then the next step was to kind of use the language of business to answer those questions. And so this is when we came to this image, which was an articulation of the problem. We took a global hydrologic model run actually by Mark Rosgrant at IFPRI, and did essentially a bunch of scenario planning where we said, all right, the economy in 2030 will look like this. Therefore, if you make a bunch of assumptions, the demand for water is going to be X, Y, and Z in all the, and we had to do it by watershed, essentially, right? Because that's the better unit to think about it. Which watershed is a good question, but let's say macro watershed. And then ask the question, okay, well, against that growth in demand, you can see it there on the left-hand side. The demand was about 4,500 cubic meters of water, billion cubic meters of water. It went up to, you know, some 6,900 billion cubic meters of water. Against that, what's the supply that's available today? You know, most water infrastructure is sort of right-sized. So it's not, you don't have a lot of places in the world where there's an enormous amount of spare capacity in delivering water. Now, if you can double click in this, there's a lot of debate as to what that supply actually means. We came up with a definition about reliable, accessible supply. It actually turns out to be how much water is available to use, unless you have a bucket and you're thinking of drawing everything out with the bucket. Actually, I can't answer, because it's about how much water is available to each demand center that you might be projecting in the future. But anyway, we came up with some estimate and came up with this and said, essentially, there's a 40% gap between the future requirements and where we are today. Now, obviously, there's no negative water in the world, right? This is a fiction that comes out of the particular way in which we did the scenarios. But it was a striking tagline, right? There's a 40% gap between the future demand and the current supply, which in simplistic language awakens a lot of decision makers, also because this gap is not just a matter for developing countries, it's a matter for everybody. So we did that, and then there's another sort of set of graphs in that report that then describe the solution in the form of a cost curve. And so we created cost curves which are essentially, economically priced and valued, rather, options for closing that gap. This much from desalination, this much from additional dam, this much from making irrigation more efficient, this much from right? And the sort of basic aha was, not only you can close that gap at the watershed level almost everywhere, but in most cases you can close it quite cheaply, but it has nothing to do with water engineering. Water engineering is the sort of far right of the cost curve. It's the most expensive option you have. In reality, there's enormous reservoirs of efficiency and productivity in agriculture, which is the primary water user in most parts of the world. And so that was kind of the big message, right? 40% gap, you can solve the problem, it doesn't need to cost a lot. And so that was kind of a rallying cry that was supposed to mobilize people. I then ended up doing this work at a country level in a number of places. So the 2030 Conagua, Mexico water security plan is the result of that. I did this in Ethiopia, in Jordan, in India. And the report itself has a bunch of case studies on Brazil, and so it was a really interesting exercise, because it really lifted the profile of water to the point that then 5 or 6 years later, the UN announced that there was a 40% gap between supply and demand. And if you kind of scratch the trail of bibliography all the way back, you discover it's in that report, which is kind of alarming, because it was me and some 25-year-old analysts sort of drawing scenarios on a whiteboard and kind of figuring out, and suddenly
this is it. I mean, zombie statistics in the water sector, they don't go away.
They don't go away, right? And it's the UN suddenly announces it, and it's true. So what did I learn? I mean, I learned a lot of things. I mean, first of all, back to the question that Jane asked earlier, a lot of sort of, there are a lot of problems with framing water issues this way, right? I mean, if you're actually a water planner and you're working in a watershed, you're likely going to be using very complicated finite element models to try and understand where the supply is. I mean, it's not a trivial matter that's easily linear. And almost by definition, this is a linear system. But the problem is that those people have been doing those models for years and years and years, and none of these politicians or CEOs were listening. So the alternative weren't between this and the sort of technically accurate answer, but it was between this and silence, right? And so one of the kind of things that I realized was that you just have to decide which simplifications you can tolerate in order to get the explanation. I think Bernard Shaw said the good explanation is the explanation that rests in the mind, right? And so in order for it to rest in the mind of somebody who's not an engineer and is not trained, it has to be simple enough and clear enough. And also sometimes, if you can't really explain it in clear and linear terms, chances are you're hiding in the black box of nonlinearity. As I'm a mathematician by training, and lots of sins you can hide in the black box of nonlinearity. So one thing was the communication value of this kind of kind of artifact. The second thing that was really powerful was that on the basis of this kind of analysis, we could sort of elevate the debate at the right level of governance in a way, because this starts looking like the kind of language that policymakers can understand and compare to other choices that they face. Because, you know, those of us who live in water think that water is everything, but for most people who don't live in water, the stock exchange, or, you know, the labor level of unemployment, or the number of vaccinated people are everything, right? I mean, it's like there are a lot of competing priorities if you're a policymaker. And this language that we adopted in this report was the first time that water was described in these terms by institutions that are listened to. Because that's the other thing, we hadn't invented anything new, but it does make a difference if the World Economic Forum and McKinsey and the World Bank use language. So it's not just about what it is you say, it's also about who says it, right? Mm-hmm. But then the ultimate question you should be asking is, okay, Giulio, that sounds very interesting. It's 10 years later, did anything happen? Because that's really the question.
That was
right?
The question I was going to ask. So thank you.
and you know, well, my own view is certainly not enough. You know, hence ergo why I'm now not producing those types of reports, but writing history books. Because I think that for all of their power in the moment, you know, the words and the story are not the only thing you need. In the end, you know, one of the kind of subtexts of my book is that a lot of this has to do with power, the distribution of power. Who has the power to make decisions, right? And unless the power shifts in some way, unless there's an actual mechanism by which power that resides in certain decision makers gets shifted, and power is a proxy for interests, right? And so interests have to really shift. Now, you could say, well, some things did happen. You know, so South Africa was a country that took up this work earnestly, and arguably, I was told by somebody at the World Economic Forum that they actually did measure a 3% reduction in the demand compared to where it had been projected to be. Then somebody else told me that that was because specific, let's say, equipment that had been produced by specific relatives of specific politicians had been sold to specific buyers, thus reducing the need for water. So then you have to ask yourself, well, was that what we were looking for? So I don't know what to tell you. I mean, so the lesson is not that these things don't matter, but I do think that the lesson is these things are certainly not enough. And the spotlight, the sort of international attention is not a substitute for the hard political work of shifting power. Politics is about power, the distribution of power. And the question of the sources of power and how they shift is really at the heart of then shifting these issues of water, because they matter, right? I mean, they're about who makes money where and with what.
Well, that's great, Giulio. And I'm going to open it up back to the students in a moment. And I would also take, having listened now, the lesson that problems without solutions are uninteresting, but the way we frame the problems determine the range of solutions available. And one thing that I think is still a frontier for further work is how you take the strategies of gaining attention on the political agenda and then extend those to the strategies for sustaining that attention, to address implementation. So what I'm going to do now, Giulio, let me just ask you, how many questions in a row are you comfortable with? I was hoping we could take a round of 3 or so.
Sure.
And then quick hit responses, and then with time permitting, go for an additional set of rounds.
Yeah,
so I'm going to go ahead and bring in some of the group now to pose some additional questions. And I'll put you on the spotlight now. One moment, I'll invite the group to pose the questions. Okay, I'm going to start with you, Nazia. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And Kalani, and then Taylor, if you've got video or if you want to just pose it on audio, we'll have a chance to hear from you as well. So why don't we start with you, Nazia?
Yeah, thank you, Giulio, first of all. In my understanding, like human behavior and their different perceptions and how, social institutions work is pretty a common factor in every kind of natural resource management, if we consider. But in your opinion, in what ways water management is unique? I mean, how the construct of human behavior inevitably affects water management on a larger scale, of course, like in your experience.
And before you respond to that, let me, if we don't have with us on video, the full group, I'm going to go ahead and pose some of the additional questions for you. From Taylor is asking, do you have a perspective as to how efficiently each type of group you've worked with accomplishes their own goals surrounding water, referring to academia, government, conservation? So that would be really helpful to hear your insights on that, Giulio. And there is a question from Kalani about the comments you've made, legitimizing central authority through engineering or technological ways, and the broader impacts of engineering solutions. So it's really just more of a comment rather than a question, but I think she comes down to a question in the next comment here, which is, when, from her perspective, engineering solutions are inevitably about helping power go hand in hand with access to water or distribution of water, how do you think this interaction will change in the future? Do you need to change the policies to get better engineering solutions, or better engineering solutions to get better policies? She notes that she feels like she's stuck in a cycle thinking about this. So anything that you can bring would be welcome.
Okay.
Over to you, Giulio.
Okay, I think I seem to have the memory of a goldfish, but I forgot your second question. So maybe I'll answer the first one and then you can remind me what it is. So why is water different? Well, start from basics, right? So since the 14th century, we've defined sovereignty over territory or land as a matter of geometry. That's why maps are so powerful instruments. Most countries, especially countries that were invaded, the drawing of the country predates the actual creation of the country. The relationship of places defines the territory and therefore defines the exercise of power. And then within that, the boundaries of a place where a government can exercise its sovereignty, a bunch of resources that get used, mineral resources, the soils, et cetera. There is only one that does work, physical work, movement, that can be measured in watts, and that's water, because it's, well, arguably wind too, but I would argue that the strength of most wind on this planet is actually a function of the release of latent heat from the evaporation of water. So water, the energetics of water matter a great deal to the forces that we experience on the landscape. If we lived much, much longer, you could say the same of geology, but of course our lifespans are much shorter, right? So it turns out that water, which is heavy and moves, is the dominant force, physical force, on the landscape. And so that presents a so people talk about water. In fact, one of the things that drives me insane is when people equate water with, say, oil and kind of coal and the new oil. It's like, there's literally nothing to do with mineral resources. It's completely the wrong mental model. So we, Homo sapiens, on the planet for about 300,000 years. Much of that period, 90+% of our history and prehistory on this planet, we're sort of moving around for the most part. We are part of the ecology, and we may or may not have sophisticated institutions prior to the Neolithic. If you read Gerber, you get convinced that there's this different life before the Neolithic. But be that as may, we have no evidence of stationary and sedentary sort of societies at large scales before the Neolithic Revolution, which happens to happen out of the last ice age. So simplifying a bit, you can imagine, we happen to become sedentary at the time of greatest water change on the surface of the planet, because glaciers are melting. If you think about the Persian Gulf, the sea level stabilized around 5000 BC. And that's roughly when the first large cities, Uruk and others, sort of emerge in Mesopotamia, right? So we happen to become stationary, in 9000, 8000 BC, and then start constructing complex societies, at least the ones that we have records of, that are not nomadic, that are not the sort of Aboriginal societies, for example, of Australia, around 5000 BC. And that's when we also, at least in the Near East, start having instances of writing and religion. So that doesn't mean that they may not have been before, but we don't have records of that before. We have records of those. Now, when you stand still in a world of moving water, which is an expression I use a lot in the book, you suddenly find yourself individually and collectively facing this very powerful force. And we have to remember that water is heavy. And if you were to take 7 billion people and squeeze the water out of all of them, you get a swimming pool the size of Central Park, about 20 to 30 stories high. We're tiny, right? We're not very heavy. On the planet, you have all this water moving around, these storms throwing water on the landscape every so often. And so very quickly, you end up with this problem of how do we exercise collective agency such that we can exercise a force that's comparable to what's being exercised by water on the landscape, so that we can, for example, deviate the river in order to protect ourselves if we decide to stay put, so that we can move water from one place to another, so we can actually grow stuff where we are, as opposed to having to collect it, and so forth and so on. And so very quickly, you end up in this kind of situation where water is inextricably tied to the ability of society of mobilizing its own social and economic resources. And that's what makes water different from anything else, because you can't, you can own, it's a very trivial, at least again since the 14th century, concept of land ownership. It's actually a trivial concept at all, but in a way. And then within land, you have all these stack of resources that go from mineral rights to trees to whatever, and they stand still and you go and take them out. But the case of water is different. So there's something very unique about water, because we've been so effective at catching water whilst it does work on the landscape in all the ways that we could imagine. We today all live in a world where we experience none of that force almost ever. But that's an accident, and it's an accident due to the fact that we have these stationary levees and dams and infrastructure that simply withstands that force. When it fails, as it happened recently in Brazil, for example, the result can be catastrophic. And then we experience what it actually looks like normally, right? Because that's normality. That's the the last thing I'll say on this, by the way, is that, so I'm Italian, I'm in Italy right now. Speaking of variation of solutions, the Romans didn't build much water infrastructure. They just owned less stuff in their homes. And so it was much more common for water to come through and occasionally flood homes. Particularly if you weren't particularly wealthy, right? Otherwise, you could build your villa on top of a hill, but if you couldn't afford that, you would have water coming through, which is, there's a wonderful short story by Faulkner called The Mississippi, in which he describes the Mississippi as that river that runs through your house and takes the piano out with it, and that's the sort of image that I have in mind when I think of this. So there are alternatives you could accept. Acceptance is the most common form of adaptation in history. You just accept that there are aspects of life where you get your feet wet. But we've decided that that's not, not the case. So anyway, so that's what makes water different. Sorry, Dustin, I've now completely forgotten the other two questions.
That's okay. We'll move to a serial processing of the questions going forward. But that was brilliant. And I wanted to thank you for the question. We had a couple, and I'm going to invite you to do, moving into a lightning round. We've got about 15 minutes before we lose Giulio, and for those of you in the rest of the class, we'll have a short break before reconvening. So we want to pose as many questions as we can and get some quick reactions. And the first one was in the chat from, I believe it was Taylor, talking about different groups. And how successful or unsuccessful they are around achieving their goals surrounding water. And the examples were
Oh,
academia,
I see. Yes,
government,
conservation
and conservation.
academics. Yeah. Yes. Well. Oh, that's such an interesting and loaded question because it
Well,
requires
and keep in
judgment
mind
on
that you
so many.
know, I think you may still be under the umbrella of your role at Nature Conservancy, so the conservation
That's right.
perspective will
That's
be
right.
biased.
I mean, what shall I say? Well, I find water. I mean, I should say this. Every time I go to a water conference, and I haven't been in a couple of years for obvious reasons, but everybody at these water conferences laments all the pathologies of the water sector. The water sector should do this. The water sector should do that. The water, there's all these complaints. Why aren't people listening to us? It's very common. And you go to engineering conferences, and the people can't get our message to, the finance minister. The finance minister, their job should be to just go to all these water conferences all the time. If you listen to the comments that people make at these conferences, and conservationists say the same, and academics say the same. Why don't you listen to me? And you go to these conferences, and these questions are always the same. And I also would observe that much of the material is always the same. So I do think that there's this interesting problem right now, which is that the water sector has become a little dogmatic. And has kind of lost a little bit contact with reality. At some level, this is not true, by the way, if you're a water engineer in the water department in, Mozambique, or, I mean, like you're living very salient issues on a daily basis, and they are politically relevant because they affect a lot of people. But in many developed countries, which is most of the resources go, most of the people who think about water are employed in America and in Europe and in Scandinavia. They just don't have a very good felt experience of what, it's highly theorized, but not terribly relevant. And so it's sort of like a little, I mean, I
Is your
hesitate
answer a
to,
version of none of the water sector is really doing well at the minute?
I think so. And that's, and in my philosophy of saying, well, if there's a problem with no solution, then why pose it? I think that the solution is sort of, in a way, I mean, not to pander to my audience here, but it is sort of some version of what you're trying to do, which is what, Dustin, you'll remember, is the sort of the point that John used to make all the time about his, his formative years at the water program at Harvard, which was this attempt at saying, well, this is because water moves and because it solicits all these different responses, it is a definition of interdisciplinarity. How do we become rigorous about interdisciplinarity? Because there's a version of interdisciplinarity that's sort of just, a TikTok of academia, which doesn't really serve anybody. And then there's a version of interdisciplinarity, which is you bring a bunch of tools which you understand deeply in order to answer specific questions that can't be answered without all these different tools, right? And that water program,
we're going to be picking up that, the question of where to start in the history with the Harvard Water Program in the 1960s.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some really interesting sort of little history. And again, it's debated, right? Because the great example of success of that water program is the work they did for Ayub Khan in Pakistan. But of course, it was Ayub Khan, right? Which, I mean, if you ask yourself, was Ayub Khan a good thing for Pakistan? I mean, there's different opinions about whether the field marshal was positive evolution in the story of Pakistan. So it's always problematic, but I think it's a great starting point, is the Harvard Water Program, and I think that water has suffered from the sort of disciplinarity. Certainly in academia, but I would say also in engineering and even in companies. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, so that's on that question.
Okay, and then I'm going to ask one question before I turn it over to Nandita to pose one, and then we'll conclude with some future-looking questions and final remarks. And that was the question that came through of basically which comes first, the engineering solutions driving policy change or good policy driving engineering solutions. I think I would be able to answer it for you, but I want to hear your take.
Well. Well, I mean, I think that at some level, I mean, obviously they feed off each other, right? I mean, what's possible then defines what. So one shouldn't be too worried about circularity because the world's full of nonlinear processes that are coupled. it's a dance. I do think there's a primacy of politics here, in the sense that sometimes people lament the sort of the big state-sponsored engineering that litters the landscapes of the world, and anytime that we end up citing Nehru and the sort of great cathedrals of modern India, somebody sort of recoils because the experience of building infrastructure had so many, a long tail of sort of victims but the fact of the matter is, this brings me back to the Republic. I mean, we make a choice of living in countries. Well, we don't make a choice, actually. That's an interesting question. But we have countries that define the we at the national level. And that we is expressed through political processes that operate at the national level. And that has advantages and disadvantages. One of the great advantages which emerged in the 20th century is that you get countries with the ability of underwriting enormous amounts of infrastructure and welfare services and other things, right? So I think that people that would like a different answer from the large-scale infrastructure have to then also engage in the question of what is the actual governance of society that you imagine you would be living in. Sometimes people make the mistake of saying, well, in the Western United States, there's plenty of examples of cooperatives and farmers that have these self-managed systems of water sharing. And Dustin, you know much more about this than I do, but they're built on the back of federal underwriting for the better part of the century that built the infrastructure that made that water fungible. Water here is not the same as water there if you don't have a thing that can move it from here to there. And so I suppose the premise is, politics supervenes these engineering questions, because once you've defined the level of governance and the sources of social power that define kind of the political architecture of a society, that then sort of defines a bit the scale of the expectations, right? And then that, in some ways, determines the ambition of the water answer. Now, that's not to say that you don't have options even within that, but you have to examine always the implications of those options. So, for example, people get obsessed about individualized technological solutions. Distributed, let's democratize water, right? Everybody has a little treatment works in the basement of their building and we're all going to be happy. Thing is, some people don't live in buildings. Some people don't have access to buildings. And so we have to remember that a lot of this infrastructure was born out of a desire to mutualize risk, to ensure that everybody had some basic access to something. So the fact that you have these centralized big utilities is not because it's not just about centralization of power, although by creating a bureaucracy, you centralize power, it's also about ensuring that everybody faces the same basic level of service, which is a fundamental welfare function. So I get it that the circularity is frustrating, but if you start unpacking what the choices are, you discover there's a primacy of politics, and then the consequences of making choices, technological choices, small versus big, individualized versus collective, you need to be examined carefully because there are a lot of unintended consequences.
Thanks, Giulio. And well, this is one of those issues where I know that we would really value having you for a lot longer, but we've only got 9 minutes. So want to discipline ourselves. I'm going to invite Nandita to pose a question, and then we'll see if we can cover about 2 or 3 more before giving you the kind of final word, so to speak. So if you can calibrate your responses accordingly. Over to Nandita.
I'll try.
Thank you so much, Giulio. That was a fascinating conversation. So my quick question is, I really like the conversation about politics asking the question and the engineer, natural scientist answering the question. And really, to make a change, you have to figure out a way to modify the question as opposed to thinking about the right answer. And I like the example that you had later in your discussion as the 40% water supply gap, as the scientists providing that kind of a nugget that can then be picked up because it is in a form that is easily accessible to the politician to say, hey, this is a problem, in a way that we can understand it rather than case study focused, and then it could move the solution in a different way. So I wanted your thoughts on the kind of nuance between water quantity and water quality.
Mhm.
So water quality challenges are also pretty ubiquitous, but they're very local. Have there been similar efforts like the one that you talk about in terms of bringing water quality into the water availability, water supply world in a language that is accessible to be taken up at a larger
Yeah.
scale?
Well, that's a great question. I fear I'm going to break the sort of 9-minute barrier here. So obviously water is an infinite set of products, because it's quality, it's also different degrees of reliability and accessibility. That sort of, so if you say, I want water, well, you want water of a certain quality at a certain time of day with a certain chance of getting it, at a certain distance from where you're sitting. And so this is a multidimensional set of attributes, right? And so you could do that analysis for each of them. So you could segment each of these dimensions and have a low quality, medium quality, high quality, and ask the question of a gap and a cost curve for that. And very quickly you get lost in a fractal problem, because then you go down, and as you say, then it becomes a local problem. So for the purpose of that research, we essentially set our limit to water that's usable for agriculture, and even that, obviously it's a crude version of it. The way in which I've seen success, so there's two ways in which water quality has kind of been elevated. One is you leave that quantitative analysis way behind, and you enter into the world of externalities and liabilities and public health. And the language that politicians understand there is the units of people. They're not cubic meters of water, right? And so you suddenly translate this to Flint, Michigan, or this is about poisoning a number of people, or Tom's River, the famous Ciba Geiger example, right? Once you're in the domain of numbers of people, people have frameworks to think about that, and you leave the sort of story behind. The other is what's happened in nutrients, where the quantity that you're managing is actually the pollutant. And so there have been pollutant markets, as Dustin, you will know, nitrogen markets and the likes. I would observe that those have not really succeeded in elevating the profile, because they're actually immaterial economically. I mean, they're interesting, but they're not lots of money, right? And so you don't end up actually, if somebody's concerned about spending billions in hospitals, they don't have time to worry about something that's worth a few $100 million. So yeah, the quality conundrum is an even bigger one in some ways than the water quantity issue.
I thought you were going to solve that for us, Giulio, but thank you for the great response. And thanks, Nandita. I find myself in a stage of early morning for all the questions that we can't give justice to. So what I'm going to do is move us toward conclusion. But note that there are a number of questions in the chat that we'll build on throughout the rest of the course. And I'm looking at, as we speak, at Navia's question, for example, related to the value of Indigenous knowledge and the insight and experience involving traditional knowledge into research and policy. So that might be something that we conclude on. But I did want to talk in the last 3 to 5 minutes of the outlook that you have about water futures and how to train as the next generation in an understanding and addressing these problems. So 2 parts. First is I'm going to ask you related to the SDGs and back to 2015 when you posted a short blog on the World Economic Forum where you said 2015 could be the turning point for water. And in light of what we've just discussed, it's useful to reflect on that. And you noted that there are 3 difficult but critical imperatives that we should address if we're going to confront the global water crisis head on. First is who gets how much when there isn't enough. Second, governments must be willing to plan and lead. And the third is the recognition that natural capital matters. 5 years, 6 years, 7 years on, what would you change about the agenda and the solution set
Yeah.
for addressing the global water crisis?
Well, first, I should say that, blogs are not academic papers. They're not statements of fact. They're instruments of influence. And so part of what you're doing with writing these things is not necessarily just saying what you think is, but what you would like people to think is. And so in that sense, I stand by those kind of three issues, even though, we have this, which may be a problem, particularly for water, this pernicious habit of thinking in kind of urgency terms. Like the climate system has the same problem. 2030, we have 10 years. We don't have 10 years, and in 2030, then we're going to have 2031, and we're still going to have the problem. And we still have to make progress. And so this idea of sort of finite boundaries is an artifact of the way in which we communicate things that's well suited for markets and for things that are nimble. When the problem is simply mobilizing an existing infrastructure, everybody's ready, let's fight, lead the army. It's much more complicated to do that if you have to build a thing, like takes time, you have to plan it. It's a different framing. So anyway, but within the framing of urgency, I think still that's true. Sorry, I lost. What was your question then? I was babbling on and forgot what you were asking me.
Well, what you would change 7 years on in terms of the solution set?
Well, I do think, I do think that two things are happening which are really quite interesting. One is that, the climate system is responding as we expected. Those of us who worked on climate issues in the 90s, there's nothing that's even remotely surprising about what's happening. And it's also not surprising what's going to happen next. I can tell you. So spoiler alert, we're going to get more of these issues. And what's going to happen is that, IDAs are going to come along and just show ever more frequently that we've dimensioned infrastructure on a statistical distribution that simply doesn't reflect where we're heading. But then those who don't have that infrastructure, who have been suffering through living with climate, let alone climate change over the last century, will have even greater problems, right? And so, but the good news is that because the sort of geopolitical center has moved east and southeast, it so happens that voices that have more immediate experience of those problems are more important. A lot of Chinese people are still very much not resilient. And that matters. And so you see a lot more talk about, India matters a lot more than it did 20 years ago. And India has a very felt experience of what it means to be water insecure, in part because they're both monsoonal countries, and in part because, there are many, many more vulnerable people. So I think that's changing, which lifts the saliency of these issues. The other thing that's happening is that I'm actually writing a piece that hopefully will come out in Project Syndicate at the end of this month. It's a long essay, so but I think land is going to take up a different role in our economy in the coming decades. One example of this is that if you collect all of our fossil fuel infrastructure in one place, you occupy a landscape the size of Qatar. But if you collect all of the projected renewable infrastructure, wind and solar, you occupy a landscape the size of Russia, right? And so suddenly the landscape's becoming our energy infrastructure, as it was, years ago when rivers were the only source of power that we were using. And so I think that land is going to have a different political importance in the next 20, 30 years. Carbon, we need to sequester carbon. And I don't think Mr. Gates has it right. We're not going to scale sequestration solutions fast enough. We're going to have to use sequestration in biomass. And we already do, by the way. A fifth of what we put in the sky comes back down into plants. And so we're going to rely on that. And we are now contracting those. Is it being contractualized, right? Because people are paying for carbon, which again happens on the landscape. So for all these reasons, I think the landscape is going to play a different role. And, the other agent aside from us on the landscape is water. And so I think that's going to change the framing. So those three imperatives are still going to be true. I fear kind of independently of the SDGs. I'm not a huge fan of I think the SDGs are a good narrative. They are a narrative framing, but I don't know that they've been driving a lot. rise of
Incidentally, that
China
essay
has.
came out upon the adoption of the SDG, and we were going to give you a chance to say whether we're going to meet it, but I think we don't have the time, and unfortunately we've run out of time. So both of those two frontiers that you noted have been flagged, and I would love to discuss and unpack them both more, and I think would agree and disagree in some areas that I think we can discuss in the future, hopefully part 2 for this discussion, Giulio.
Cool.
And certainly something that we can bring in to the class discussions going forward. So in addition to thanking you, I wanted to give you the very last word in a tweet length or shorter. What would be your parting words of advice to this next generation of how they can change the water world?
You know how long it takes me to write the tweet? I mean, it's just like, well, I mean, I think you're working, you know, you want to work in the right, you're working in the right field. I do think that one of the great things about water is that it's a lens through which to see the world. And so I think don't shy away from looking at the world. Don't just focus on the sort of narrow disciplinary questions of how to build a dam or how to plan an ecosystem or whatever, but just, you know, use it as a discipline to interpret the world. And if you do, I've found at least that it can be incredibly instructive.
Love it, Giulio. See water in the world. We are very much aligned on that. And I am ever so grateful, genuinely, for you making the time. And I do, you think you know that the threat is sincere, that part 2 is coming. I think there's a lot
pleasure. Love
that
to.
we can have. But thanks so much again for your time. Have a lovely evening. And let me encourage through the chat or through your participation buttons to send your claps and your thanks from the full group. Thanks, Giulio.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we are back, and just a short bit over time. Lots to dig in there, which we'll have a chance to do some today, but throughout the rest of the term and in the program. Take a break. Nandita, I think we should do 15 minutes, so regroup at 20 after, and we'll see you for the next part.